The dining hall was dimly lit when Emily, Alice, Maggie, and Liam entered, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Their footsteps echoed across the stone floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the vast, empty space. The group paused just inside the doorway, their flashlights casting long, flickering beams across the hall. "Does anyone else smell that?" Liam asked, breaking the silence. Emily sniffed the air and froze. A rich, tantalizing aroma wafted through the room. Roasted meats, fresh bread, sweet desserts. It was utterly out of place in the decaying castle, where every other space reeked of damp stone and decay. "There's no way," Alice muttered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That smell, how? I don't like this," Maggie said, her tone sharp. She stepped forward cautiously, her flashlight revealing something that made the group gasp. The long banquet table that stretched down the center of the hall was no longer covered in dust and cobwebs. Instead, it gleamed with polished silverware, delicate china, and crystal goblets. Platters piled high with food lined the table's surface: roasted pheasant, steaming vegetables, golden brown pies. The candlelit chandeliers overhead flickered, casting a warm, golden glow over the surreal feast. But what stopped them in their tracks were the diners, the ghostly guests. Figures filled the chairs around the table, their forms translucent and flickering like images seen through a haze of smoke. They were dressed in 17th century finery, lace cuffs, velvet jackets, and bejeweled gowns. They moved in eerie unison, lifting their forks and knives to their mouths in a silent mimicry of dining. No sound accompanied their movements, no clinking of silverware, no murmur of conversation. The room was deathly quiet. "Oh my God," Alice whispered, gripping Emily's arm. "Are they spirits?" Maggie said, her voice low, locked in some kind of loop. Liam took a step closer to the table, his curiosity overcoming his fear. "They look so real," he murmured, reaching out a tentative hand toward one of the apparitions. "Don't," Maggie snapped, pulling him back. "You don't know what touching them might do." The nearest ghost, a portly man with a powdered wig and an elaborate waistcoat, turned his head sharply as if he'd heard them. His eyes were hollow, black voids that sent a chill down Emily's spine. The ghost's lips curled into a grotesque imitation of a smile before he returned to his silent eating. The ghostly invitation. The group backed away, but before they could retreat to the doorway, a loud clang echoed through the hall. They turned to see that the double doors had slammed shut, trapping them inside. The chandeliers overhead flickered violently, and the warm glow of the room dimmed to a sickly greenish hue. Emily's flashlight sputtered, and when it steadied, a new figure stood at the head of the table. It was a woman, tall and regal, with dark hair swept up in an elaborate style. Her gown was black and shimmering, as though it were made of liquid shadow. Her pale face was expressionless, but her eyes gleamed with malice. "Welcome," the woman said, her voice cold and echoing. "You are just in time for the feast." Emily's mouth went dry as she tried to find her voice. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "A hostess of sorts. This is my banquet, and you." She gestured toward the group with one elegant hand. "You are my guests. We don't want to stay," Maggie said firmly, stepping forward. "Let us go." The woman's smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened. "No one leaves the banquet," she said. "Not until they've had their fill." As if on cue, the ghostly diners stopped eating and turned their heads toward the group, their hollow eyes gleaming with unnatural light. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe. The haunted feast. The woman raised her hand, and the platters of food began to move. A roasted pheasant slid down the table, stopping just before Emily. A goblet of deep red wine floated toward Alice, the liquid inside swirling like blood. The scent of the food grew stronger, more intoxicating, but it was tinged with something sour, decay hiding beneath the surface. "Eat," the woman commanded, her voice resonating with unnatural power, "or you will offend your host." "We're not eating anything," Emily said, her voice trembling but defiant. The woman's smile faded, her expression twisting into one of anger. "You insult my generosity," she hissed. "No one refuses my feast." The ghostly diners stood in unison, their chairs scraping against the stone floor. They began to advance toward the group, their movements slow and deliberate. "Move," Maggie shouted, grabbing Emily's arm. The group scrambled toward the far end of the hall, dodging the ghostly figures as they reached out with pale, translucent hands. The horror revealed. As they ran, the room began to change. The sumptuous feast decayed before their eyes. The roasted pheasant rotted, its flesh falling away to reveal a skeletal frame. The vegetables turned to black sludge, and the pies crumbled into piles of ash. The ghostly figures themselves began to deteriorate, their elegant clothing fraying, and their flesh melting away to expose bone. Emily tripped and fell, landing hard on the stone floor. She looked up to see one of the apparitions looming over her, its face now a grotesque skull with hollow eyes that burned with green fire. It reached for her with skeletal hands, its bony fingers inches from her face. Before it could touch her, Maggie appeared, slamming a small wooden cross into the ghost's chest. The apparition let out a deafening wail and dissolved into smoke. "Get up!" Maggie shouted, pulling Emily to her feet. The group regrouped near the head of the table, where the regal woman still stood. Her form was flickering now, her once beautiful face distorted with rage. The shadows around her swirled violently, and her voice boomed through the hall. "You cannot escape the banquet," she roared. "You will join us, as all the others have before you." The escape. Maggie stepped forward, holding the cross high. "You are bound to this place," she said, her voice commanding. "Release us, or face the light." The woman let out a shriek of fury, and the shadows around her surged forward, engulfing the group. Emily felt herself being pulled into the darkness, the cold seeping into her bones. She fought against it, her hands clawing at the air, until she felt Maggie's hand close around her wrist. "Hold on!" Maggie shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She began to chant in a language Emily didn't recognize, and the cross in her hand began to glow with a brilliant white light. The shadows recoiled, and the woman let out a final, ear-piercing scream before her form shattered like glass. The ghostly diners vanished, and the room was plunged into silence. The group collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The dining hall was empty once more, the table covered in dust and cobwebs as though nothing had happened. A chilling reminder. Emily sat up, her heart still racing. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A memory," Maggie said, her voice weary. "A fragment of the past, trapped here by the castle's curse." Alice shuddered. "I don't care what it was. I just want to get out of here." As they made their way back to the library, Emily glanced over her shoulder. The dining hall was still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. When they reached the safety of the library, Emily opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence. "The dead don't forget." Rotting food. The dining hall was eerily quiet when the group entered again, the scent of decay lingering faintly in the air. Emily clutched her flashlight tightly, its beam bouncing across the long, ancient banquet table that stretched the length of the room. Dust motes hung in the air, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the narrow windows. Alice took a hesitant step forward, her shoes scuffing against the stone floor. "Why do we keep coming back here?" she muttered. "It's like this place is pulling us in." Maggie, standing close behind her, nodded grimly. "Because it is. The dining hall is a nexus. Whatever's haunting this castle is tied to this room." As if in response to her words, the air in the room grew heavier, carrying with it a rich, cloying aroma. It was the unmistakable scent of a feast: roasted meats, fresh bread, sweet wine. Emily's stomach turned as the smell became stronger, more overpowering with each passing second. "Do you smell that?" Liam asked, his voice tight. "That's not possible." Before anyone could answer, the chandeliers overhead flickered to life, their flames casting a golden glow across the room. The group gasped as the table transformed before their eyes. Where moments ago there had been only dust and cobwebs, now set a lavish feast, every surface covered with food. A false feast. The table gleamed with an impossible opulence. Platters piled high, with roasted meats glistened with golden brown skins. Bowls overflowed with bright, glistening fruits and steaming vegetables. Decanters of wine sparkled in the candlelight, their ruby-red contents glowing as though lit from within. The sight was so vivid, so tantalizing, that for a moment Emily forgot where she was. "It's beautiful," Liam said, his voice tinged with awe. But Maggie's sharp intake of breath broke the spell. "No," she said firmly. "It's a trap. Don't touch anything." Alice leaned closer to one of the plates, her brow furrowing. "It looks real," she said, reaching out hesitantly toward a loaf of bread. "Don't," Maggie snapped, grabbing Alice's wrist before her fingers could make contact. "Nothing here is as it seems." Emily stepped closer to the table, her eyes scanning the feast. Her stomach churned at the richness of the scents. The sweetness was cloying, the savory notes almost rancid. Something about the display was wrong, though she couldn't immediately pinpoint what. And then she saw it, the decay. At first, it was subtle. A darkened edge on the slice of pie nearest her, a faint gray tint to the grapes spilling from a silver bowl. But as she watched, the transformation became grotesque. The crust of the pie began to blacken and collapse inward, the fruit withering to shriveled husks. The roasted pheasant at the table center bubbled and split, its golden skin giving way to a gray, oozing sludge. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. The others turned to look, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as the entire feast began to rot before their eyes. The bread molded, sprouting patches of green and white fuzz that spread like wildfire. The wine in the goblets darkened, thickening into a viscous black liquid that dripped over the edges like tar. The worst, however, were the maggots. They appeared suddenly, writhing out of the decaying food in waves. They spilled from the ruptured meats, crawled over the collapsing fruit, and squirmed in the pools of black liquid spreading across the table. The sound of their movements filled the room, a faint, wet squelching that made Emily's stomach churn. Alice staggered back, covering her mouth. "Oh my God," she gasped. "What is this?" "It's not real," Maggie said, though her voice trembled. "It's an illusion, a manifestation of the castle's power. It looks real enough to me," Liam said, his face pale. "And it smells." The aroma of the feast had turned putrid, the rich scents now overpowered by the stench of rot and decay. Emily gagged, turning away from the table, but the sight of the floor stopped her in her tracks. The maggots weren't confined to the table. They were spilling over the edges, dropping onto the stone floor with soft, sickening plops. They writhed in every direction, a living carpet of pale, wriggling bodies. A voice in the rot. The group backed away, but the transformation wasn't over. The candles in the chandeliers flickered violently, their light dimming to a sickly green. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, deeper, and from somewhere within them came a voice. "Why do you disturb us?" It was low and guttural, layered with 1,000 overlapping whispers. Emily's skin prickled as the voice seemed to surround them, pressing down on her like a physical weight. "We didn't mean to disturb anything," Maggie said, stepping forward. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were filled with fear. "We're here to understand, to help." "Help," the voice sneered. "There is no help, only hunger." The shadows on the walls began to writhe, coalescing into grotesque forms. Faces emerged, twisted, hollow-eyed visages that stared at the group with unblinking malice. The maggots surged toward them, a churning tide of decay that threatened to swallow them whole. "Run!" Maggie shouted. The flight. The group bolted for the doors, their footsteps slipping on the slick, writhing floor. Emily clutched her flashlight like a lifeline, its beam barely cutting through the darkness as the shadows seemed to close in around them. The voice followed them, its tone growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape the feast. You are ours now." The doors to the dining hall, which had slammed shut when they entered, groaned as Maggie threw her shoulder against them. With a final, desperate shove, they burst open, and the group stumbled out into the corridor. The stench of decay vanished the moment they crossed the threshold, replaced by the familiar chill of the castle. Emily turned to look back, her heart pounding, but the dining hall was empty once more. The table was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the chandeliers were dark. What the hell was that? Alice demanded, her voice shaking. A warning, Maggie said, her tone grim. The castle isn't just trying to scare us. It's trying to claim us. Unanswered questions. The group returned to the library, their nerves frayed and their energy drained. Emily sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she flipped through her notebook. She scrawled the words Phantom Feast in the margin, her mind racing to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Why show us that? She asked aloud. What does it want? Maggie hesitated before answering. Power, she said finally. The castle feeds on fear, pain, and death. The feast was a reminder of what it's taken, and what it can still take. Alice sat down heavily, her face pale. We can't keep doing this, she said. Every time we stay here, it gets worse. What if next time it doesn't let us leave? Emily glanced at Maggie, who met her gaze with quiet determination. Then we don't give it the chance, Maggie said. We end this. For Evelyn. For all of them. Vanishing host. The group lingered in the library, their nerves still raw from the grotesque feast they had witnessed. Emily sat in a stiff-backed chair, her notebook open in her lap, but her pen hovered uselessly above the page. She kept replaying the scene in her mind. The maggots spilling from the table, the food dissolving into decay, the malevolent voice taunting them. What did it mean? She asked finally, breaking the silence. Why show us that? It's all connected, Maggie said, pacing the length of the room. Her dark robes brushed against the floor, and her face was set in deep concentration. The castle doesn't waste its energy on random scares. Everything it does is deliberate. Alice groaned from her seat near the window. Deliberate or not, we need to stop wandering into its traps. We keep asking questions, and it keeps giving us nightmares. I don't think we're done with the dining hall, Maggie said, ignoring Alice's complaint. She turned to face Emily. It wants us to go back. Emily felt her stomach twist at the thought. You think it's unfinished? Maggie nodded. There's more it needs us to see. Liam shook his head, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. What if it's just trying to keep us there? To trap us like those things at the table? It's a risk we'll have to take, Maggie said firmly. Emily closed her notebook and stood. She wasn't eager to return to the dining hall, but something deep inside her, the same instinct that had driven her to Ballygally in the first place, compelled her to follow the thread of the mystery, no matter how dangerous it became. Returned to the dining hall. The hall was quiet when they returned, the oppressive atmosphere as stifling as before. The chandeliers hung dark overhead, and the table was once again covered in dust and cobwebs. There was no sign of the feast or the maggots, but the memory of it lingered in the air like a stain. This place gives me the creeps, Alice muttered, crossing her arms as she scanned the room. Why are we even here? Because it wants us here, Maggie said, moving toward the head of the table. Her steps were slow and deliberate, as though she were trying not to disturb something unseen. As the group approached the table, the air grew colder. Emily's breath misted in front of her, and the fine hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The faint scent of food returned, not the putrid decay of before, but something subtler, almost enticing. Before anyone could speak, a faint shimmer appeared at the far end of the table. The group froze, their flashlights trained on the spot as the shimmer coalesced into a figure, the faceless host. The figure that emerged was unlike anything Emily had seen before. It was humanoid in shape, tall, and dressed in elegant black attire that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Its head, however, was featureless, a smooth, blank surface where a face should have been. The figure inclined its head slightly, as if acknowledging their presence. It raised an arm, its movements fluid and unnatural, and gestured toward the table. "Welcome," it said. Its voice was soft and melodious, yet it carried an undercurrent of something cold and ancient. "You honor us with your presence." Alice took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. What are you?" The faceless figure didn't respond immediately. It moved closer to the table, its movements unnervingly smooth, and gestured again. "You are our guests," it said, ignoring the question. "Come, sit, feast." "No thanks," Liam said, his voice tight. "We've seen what your food turns into." The figure turned its head toward him, though it had no eyes to see. "A shame," it said. "You do not yet understand the gift that has been offered." Emily took a step forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "Why are we here?" she asked. "What do you want from us?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as though considering her question. "You are here because you have wandered too far," it said. "Because you have disturbed the balance." "The balance of what?" Maggie asked sharply. The figure turned toward her. "Time," it said simply. "This place exists outside it, and yet you bring its weight with you. Your questions unravel the threads." A cryptic warning. Emily felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean by that? Are we making things worse?" The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. "The castle is a vessel," it said. "It holds what should not be released. But your meddling weakens the walls." Alice let out a nervous laugh, her voice strained. "So what? We're just supposed to leave? Pretend none of this is happening." The faceless host tilted its head again, as if amused. "You will not leave," it said. "Not as you are. You are part of the feast now." The word sent a chill through Emily. "What feast?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure gestured toward the table, where the dust and cobwebs had begun to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the table began to transform once more. The plates and goblets shimmered, their tarnished surfaces regaining their former luster. The scent of food grew stronger, richer, but Emily could sense the rot lurking just beneath it. "The feast of time," the figure said, "of memory, of pain. It is endless, as it must be." The vanishing. Before the group could react, the figure stepped back, its form fading into a faint shimmer. Its voice lingered, echoing through the hall. "Stay too long, and you will never leave." The room fell silent, the transformation of the table halting mid-process. The plates and goblets remained half-polished, the food half-formed, as though the spell had been interrupted. The group stood frozen, the weight of the figure's warning sinking in. "What the hell was that supposed to mean?" Alice asked, her voice rising in panic. "We're part of the feast now. What does that even mean?" "It means we're running out of time," Maggie said, her tone grim. "The castle's grip on us is growing stronger." Emily's gaze lingered on the table, her mind racing. The faceless host's words had been cryptic, but one thing was clear. Their presence in the castle was unraveling something ancient and dangerous. If they stayed much longer, they risked becoming part of the castle's endless cycle. A desperate decision. "We need answers," Emily said, turning to Maggie. "Real answers. There has to be a way to break this, to end it." Maggie nodded. "Agreed. But we'll need to be careful. The castle isn't going to let us leave without a fight." Liam shook his head, his face pale. "Maybe Alice is right. Maybe we should just cut our losses and get out of here." Emily looked at him, her expression hardening. "And what happens to Evelyn? To all the others trapped here?" Liam didn't respond. He looked away, his jaw tight. "Then we move forward," Maggie said. "Whatever's keeping this place alive, whatever's holding Evelyn, we find it, and we destroy it." The group nodded reluctantly, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the air. As they turned to leave the dining hall, Emily glanced back at the table one last time. The half-formed feast remained, a grotesque reminder of the castle's power. The faceless host's words echoed in her mind. "Stay too long, and you will never leave."